Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 11:15 session with Shashi Tharoor and John Wilson. My name is Michael Dwyer. I have to do a little short introduction for Shashi because I think there might be somebody in the audience who doesn't know who he is. Put your hand up if you don't know who he is. Shashi served for 29 years at the United Nations, culminating as Under-Secretary General. He's a Congress MP, a former minister, the author of 15 books, and has won numerous literary awards, including a Commonwealth Writers' Prize. And this year saw the publication of his new book on Indian history, An Era of Darkness. In the middle is John Wilson. John is a Doctor of History, DPhil Oxford, studied anthropology at the New School in New York. He's the author of many scholarly articles on Indian history, most recently 2016 of India Conquered, Britain's Raj and the Chaos of Empire. He once famously described fellow historian Niall Ferguson, and I quote, as the Leni Riefenstahl of George Bush's new imperial order, criticizing in The Guardian Ferguson's Channel 4 series book on the British Empire for presenting, quote, the acceptable face of imperial brutality, end quote. So I'm going to ask Shashi to talk about his book for 5 or 6 minutes, then John will respond, and then we'll get the conversation going. Shashi.
Thank you, Michael, and I must say that this is a thrill to see you all here today, and that to know that a book on the 200 years of British rule and what it left us with still stimulates so much interest in our country. My book basically has a very simple proposition. It says that the British came to one of the richest countries in the world at the time, 23% of global GDP at the beginning of the 19th century, 27% at the beginning of the 18th century, a very prosperous country, and over 200 years of rule reduced it to one of the poorest countries in the world. And that essentially is the narrative that I have tried to describe in great detail, while at the same time taking into account the other side, the arguments that have been made for what we should be grateful to the British for. And you all know the standard list. We are supposed to be grateful for the railways, the rule of law, political democracy, the English language, tea, and even cricket. And I try and take each of these things in turn and demonstrate how not a single one of them was intended for the benefit of Indians, but was brought here either for the British or to further British colonial interests, was built for British profit and run through British racism. So it's not a narrative history as such. It is a systematic dismantling of the case that has been made in recent years by the likes of Niall Ferguson, whom John Wilson's memorable cutting-edge remark about you already heard this morning. Many other apologists for the British Empire have been flourishing on the bestseller lists in the last 10 or 15 years, and what they have been doing is arguing that the British Empire was a good thing, in Ferguson's phrase, that it laid the fundamentals down for the globalized era of today, and that the killer apps of modern civilization, as it were brought here to India and to the other colonies by the British Empire. To which I explain that you don't actually need to go to the trouble and expense of being colonized in order to have a railway line. You can actually buy the blessed thing and build it, as some countries did manage to do. I also go into some detail about the dismantling of India's industries. People don't realize we were one of the world's leading industrial powers in the 18th century. We were the world's leading manufacturer of textiles and the world's leading exporter of textiles. We made the best and longest lasting ships in the world, and we had invented steel, something which people didn't quite realize. In fact, our steel technology was taken off by the Arabs to make the famous Damascus steel. And our steel was so good that when the East India Company soldiers in the early wars killed Indian soldiers, they would dismount and steal their swords because the Indian soldiers carried swords of a steel so much superior to anything available in Europe. But these were systematically dismantled by the British, and their control of the ports and the laws meant the imposition of tariffs and duties and taxes on Indian goods, and of course free entry for British goods that then flooded our markets. And all of this is laid out in unsparing detail. Some of you do know of my Oxford speech a few years ago, a year and a half ago, in which I talked about this. But obviously a 330-page book takes a little more research than a 10-minute speech. And so I did actually toss in some 30 pages of endnotes if any of you are curious about my sources for some of this information that I'm going to surprise you with, I suppose surprise some of you with in the book. So it's all there. I don't want to go into greater detail. I'm quite happy to go into further detail under Michael's and John's examination. But for now, that's broadly what the book is about. And it ends with a look at the afterlife of colonialism, whose impact still lingers in many ways across the world. Very distracting Hindi speech going on from there, which I can't help hearing with one ear. But anyway, I'll try to concentrate on Michael and John instead.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed Shashi's book enormously, and I think we're on the same side in this argument. If there is an argument, I think perhaps he slightly overestimates how powerful the defensive empire is in Britain. I think a lot of people would agree in Britain with the position that both of us hold about the impoverishment, in particular, of India under British rule. And I think people like Niall Ferguson and Andrew Roberts are becoming outliers. Maybe I'm being too optimistic about
Well,
Britain.
I cite a Gallup poll fairly recently, which actually shows a startlingly high percentage of Brits would love to have the empire back.
But if you prod and you poke and you give them a bit more information, then you'd have a different perspective. When I grew up, we thought the British Empire was Australia and Canada. That's probably and India was forgotten about. So that's probably what they're thinking of. So what's most powerful about this perspective and the perspective I share with Shashi, and that I argue in my book too, is the argument about the British destruction of Indian political institutions. Before British rule, there was no chaos, no anarchy. India possessed a viable political system, a Mughal political system, but that was capable of accommodating different states, different polities, and was economically successful. And there are various moments of crisis that occur in that system, which the British sort of intervene within. But over 100 years, British violence, British force, British arms destroy Indian political institutions, and that's why India becomes the poor society it becomes. It's because the kind of institutional underpinnings of prosperity are destroyed, and destroyed because the British are jealous of their own power. And that's kind of the argument of my book, of India Conquered, is that, paradoxically, if you think about the whole period of the East India Company's interest in India and the period of the Raj, this isn't a system of government that's only about profit. To begin with, it starts with an interest in profit, with an interest in making money. But very quickly it becomes a political machine in its own right. And we all know about political machines that sustain themselves, that just kind of keep on going. People like power, they like the feeling of power, they like to be an authority. They don't like being challenged. The British have this peculiarly prickly, paranoid attitude towards power in India. They constantly feel that they're going to be challenged, and they are constantly challenged. And so they build this kind of system of rule that is jealous of power and wants to kind of basically be recognized as the only kind of sort of political force in the subcontinent, wherever it might be, even if it's in the 1680s and they're interested in a fort in one particular place. They find any kind of negotiation and any back and forth difficult. So as Shashi very well puts it, if you want to build a railway, you can just buy one. You know, similarly, if you want to trade with India, just trade with India. There were merchants, European merchants, who were doing that. But this is a peculiar form of power that is interested in power for its own sake. And I think that, so my argument through India Conquered is that the British are violent, kind of driven by these strange passions almost, emotions, rather than being a kind of rational system. But this kind of destabilizing negative form of power does create, though, room for Indians to do stuff, you know, kind of not to challenge politically, but to build economic institutions of various kinds, to build cultural institutions, to build, build, if you like, the kind of the infrastructure of a nation in a certain sense. And I think that's a story that we often forget, that there's sort of elements of national life being incubated, not because the British want it to exist at all, but you know that can exist in the latter phases of British rule.
So I can just come in here and say that's not part of the quote-unquote civilizing mission. It's a happenstance. It's a byproduct.
There is no civilizing mission. There was never any civilizing mission. This is a kind of delusion that lots of historians talk about.
Shashi, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, well, I actually make this argument. You know, when the East India Company was ruling officially, though increasingly the British government was ruling through the name of the East India Company, the fact is that they really were in it for the money and didn't pretend very much otherwise. And I've quoted a lot of writings of Englishmen in India. The easiest place in the world for a not particularly talented Englishman to prosper was India, because you know, you just come here and make money hand over fist, and they did. But it was only after the Queen formally took over in 1858, after the so-called mutiny, that some of the justificatory language began to be used about civilizing the native, about, you know, trying to sort of bring all the values of Western Christian civilization to the savages and the infidels and so on, which actually had been largely absent in the first period of British rule. I point out that whereas, for example, with the Portuguese and the Spanish, their clerics and bishops sort of showed up almost immediately with the first guys with muskets. In the case of the British, the first bishop only showed up around 1820. They really weren't seriously into civilizing. They just wanted to do what was minimally necessary to preserve their power and enable themselves to make a lot of money. I should add, John's book is a fabulous one. I actually reviewed it at some length for India Today. And one of the points he's just made, which is worth underscoring, is the extent to which empire begins to become an exercise in its own self-perpetuation. You're in power, and your only purpose for being in power is to stay in power. And that became the characteristic of the empire for a very long time. And I think it explains, for example, things like their appalling mismanagement of famines. I don't think you make enough of that in the book, John, but in my book, I've really gone into this because 35 million Indians died totally unnecessary deaths because of British policy on famines. I can give you 3 simple principles that the British felt they should follow as rulers. They said, number one, that famines essentially in the Malthusian system, if the land could not sustain the population that it needed to feed, then people should die and the natural balance should be corrected. That was a belief the British held. A second belief, of course, was free market principles. Adam Smith, don't interfere with the market. People can't afford to buy food, too bad, let them die. And the third principle was a very sort of petty Victorian one of fiscal prudence. Do not spend money you haven't budgeted for. So on the basis of these 3 principles, they said, we will not help people dying in famines. It was a policy decision. In fact, let's admit that it was not pure racism, because they did exactly the same thing in Ireland, which is why you had the horrendous deaths in Ireland during the potato famine of the 1840s and so many Irish migrating to America, because the British did not let people help starving Irishmen either. But in India, it was appalling. I found one instance in the Orissa famine of 1866, where a kind-hearted Englishman wants to help a person who's dying, and he is seen by the authorities and warned that if he gives assistance to people who are dying, he will be expelled from India and sent back to his home country, England. This was the sort of attitude that was a matter of British policy. And it's something we don't really realize. And then, of course, you go all the way to Winston Churchill. I gather there's already been a session on his appalling behavior during the Great Bengal famine. But Churchill specifically decreed that there should be no assistance to the starving Bengalis, And he accompanied it with vile racist language. I mean, you know, quote unquote, the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis matters much less than that of sturdy Tommies, quote unquote. He shipped grain from Bengal off to England, continuing a policy that had gone on for 150 years. They shipped grain from Orissa also when the Orissa famine was happening. So they shipped grain not even to feed actual people, but to buffer their reserve stocks in Europe in the event of a future invasion of Greece. And when conscience-stricken British officials wrote to the Prime Minister, as Churchill was at the time, saying that people are dying because of your decisions, all Churchill could do was write in the margin, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man whom the British like to hail as an apostle of freedom and democracy.
I was going to refine your picture of famine slightly but it's, you know, to show how things are even more calculating, which is that much of the time British policy was not to allow people to die, but to give them enough just to survive.
That's late 19th century.
Yeah, but the only way in which it's possible to find out what you require just to survive is to allow some people to die and then say, oh, no, we need to increase the grain allowance or whatever by a tiny amount. So it's extraordinary. But what's interesting about famine policy is that the motive throughout, the intention throughout, is to do whatever it takes to, and this is the point, my point, to support British sovereignty, to support British power. The first intervention by the British against famines is to stop famine victims flocking into the centre of cities where there is British power. So British officials initially regard famine victims as potential insurgents, people who are going to challenge British authority. So they create public works projects, small-scale public works projects, you know, projects that employ Indians in various ways, provide labour, you know, kind of hard work to famine victims for little money, you know, away from the site of political authority, so that people are pulled away from actually challenging British power. I think we should come on to...
But, you know, the so-called temple wage,
No, that's
which
right,
had nothing to do with the Hindu religion, by the way, because it was named for Sir Richard Temple, the official who concocted this wage, essentially was for the work camps that the British finally installed in the 1870s for famines because of the horrendous press they got for the 1866 Orissa famine.
Exactly.
But when they did this, the actual subsistence food given to Indians, it has been calculated, was lower than what the Nazis gave to the inmates of the Buchenwald concentration camp. And you've seen pictures of those Buchenwald survivors. That's what the Indians were given in the British work and relief camp.
And these famine camps with their subsistence wages are something we need to study a lot more, because there are a lot of them, you know, millions of people were employed in different ways in them. And I think they, you know, and they are about paying Indians the minimum necessary to survive. And I think that, you know, if there are people who want to go on and do sort of historical research in the audience, who are interested in doing PhDs in this, let me know. But, you know, I think that they could be crucial in making India into a kind of low-wage economy. They set a pattern of you can get away with paying people exceptionally low wages.
I'd just like to get on to the question now of historiography, the study of history. Kick off with asking, Shashi, why you decided to write the book, why you decided to write it now, and given that we are amidst what you might call a resurgence of atavistic nationalism globally, China, Russia, Iran, some would say India.
And the US.
Above all, is the timing of your book's publication to some extent a warning call that we don't let this sort of stuff happen again, although it's too late, it's happened?
Well, you know, first of all, I honestly hadn't planned to write this book. As I say, the very first sentence of my book is, this book somewhat unusually began as a speech, because I made that speech at Oxford really, I mean, almost off the top of my head, on the way to a literary festival in Wales, to which at that time I accorded more importance. And it was only a sort of several weeks later when it was posted by Oxford University on their YouTube site. And I tweeted a link. Suddenly it went viral. And not just viral, it sort of broke sort of pretty much every record for a speech circulating on YouTube, and it seized a lot of passions. I mean, somebody calculated over 100 op-eds were written just on this speech in a very short period of time. So my publisher, David Davidar of Aleph, a former Viking Penguin man, David called me and said, you've got to make a book of this. And I said, why bother? Everyone knows this already. And he said, no, they don't, because if they did, your speech wouldn't have gone viral. which I suppose makes sense. So I said, all right, fair enough, I'll try and write something. And that's how the book emerged. It really wasn't, in fact, it wasn't even consciously pitched for the 70th anniversary of India's independence, though that obviously doesn't hurt because people are now thinking of various themes to do with Indian nationhood, and surely this fits into that as well. But having said all that, Michael, I certainly would not want to be seeing this as part of some sort of nationalist resurgence. Because, first of all, yes, I mean, I don't want to cede the nationalist argument to one particular political tendency in my country, because I think nationalism was a legitimate cause of people who were not bigots or chauvinists, who were inclusive in their nationalism. And I've written of a nationalism which is profoundly against foreign rule, racism, foreign exploitation, but is not in any way beyond that an assertion of any chauvinistic identity politics. And therefore it's a bit different from the other examples you've cited in other countries where, I'm sorry to say, there seems to be a certain element of atavistic reassertion of narrow identities, which is not what my beliefs or politics or writings have ever been about.
And John, could you come in on your writing in your book in response to what Shashi just said about the evolution of Indian nationalism from, say, 1857 onwards?
Yeah, before I do that, though, let me say, I mean, in a sense, my sort of motive for writing my book was, similar to Shashi's, which is this book didn't exist, and a book like Shashi's didn't exist, and it is. I think it's a sign of the over-specialization of the historical profession. Every historian knows all this stuff. We know about what the famine, we know about the decline in Indian living standards, etc. But it's not there for a broader public, and that's kind of vital. I think. And Shashi's right to talk about the need to think about, politically about different kinds of nationalism, kind of a kind of nationalism which is inclusive. And I think that's true for Britain as well as for India. And I hope this debate might go some way towards thinking in Britain about a kind of a British nationalism which is anti-imperial and saying there's this imperial element in our past. It's not the whole history of Britain. There's lots we can celebrate in the history of Britain, but this empire is something we need to kind of sort of reject and challenge. But I suppose my big surprise in reading Shashi's book actually is that there isn't very much about the Indian nation. That this is a book about British rule and kind of Indian nationalism, Indian institutions in various ways emerge under British rule, in opposition to British rule, in lots of really complicated, interesting ways that we don't study enough. And yet that's almost entirely absent from this story. And so it's a book that sees the British as this kind of almost such an overwhelming force that one almost reads as if there's no room for Indian nationalism there. So where, you're an Indian nationalist in a good, positive, progressive way. Why not say more about kind of the kind of Indian politics that emerges through this process?
Well, there was only so much one could fit into the book. What I do talk about, though, in the particular context of the lead up to partition, was the way in which the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League diverged and the role the British played, both in systematically trying to promote the Muslim League as an alternative to the Indian National Congress, and even at the tactical level, as it were, during the Second World War, facilitating the various bits of favors to the League that enable them to exercise privilege and patronage and so on out of offices to which they had not been elected, while the Congress leaders and workers languished in jail. And the League, therefore, under British patronage, their membership went up from a few lakhs before the start of the Second World War to a couple of crores at the end of the Second World War. And that's when the possibility of partition became a reality, because they then finally, for the first time, swept the Muslim seats in the 1946 election. So again, it's the development of Indian political institutions there under the malign influence of the British. And if you go right back to the partition of Bengal in 1905, for example, I talk about how the British were explicitly trying to sell this as an exercise in creating a Muslim majority province for the first time in India. And when the Muslim Nawab of Dhaka said, this is a beastly idea and I won't support it, the British quietly slipped him £100,000 and then he sang a different tune. So a lot of these political changes that we see in the first half of the 20th century came about directly because of the British and with British influence.
Yeah.
So that's why I felt it was necessary to focus on that.
And that's, I think I'd completely agree with that, but that's for me, that's a very narrow part of the story that is all about the central state and state power, governmental power. And so what I think is interesting about Indian nationalism, in the late 19th and early 20th century, which I don't think Shashi talks about enough, is that it's not interested only in seizing state power. It says, okay, we'll fight the British when we have to, but for the moment we can't do that. We can't oppose their armies and their law courts. But instead we're going to create institutions. We're going to create a culture. We're going to create a public life, civil society, which is Indian, which is national. And you have this extraordinary period of institution building, which includes kind of cultural institutions, lots of different religious institutions, Muslim, Hindu, whatever, Deoband and the Arya Samaj are both a product of this, both about saying we need to create some kind of power that is non-imperial, but also economic power. All the banks that dominate India now, Indian banks that you see around you, they weren't created by the British. The Canara Bank wasn't created by the British. The Punjab National Bank wasn't created by the British. The Indian Bank wasn't created by the British. They were created by nationalists, by people in their different communities who wanted to, contribute to their national kind of regeneration. And I find it astonishing that that's not the story that we're telling. There's a kind of story that people can be proud of, as well as about India and what Indians did in opposition to British rule. This is not about the civilizing mission. It's not about collaboration. It's about people doing things outside of spheres of British influence. But it happened during the time when the British were formally in power. And it creates the basis for a different kind of nationalism, a much more progressive, I think, kind of nationalism.
Absolutely. In fact, one place where I do mention this is, again, in talking about famines, where I mentioned how when the British weren't helping, Indian organizations came up and conducted an extraordinary amount of famine relief and charitable work. So, the development of Indian institutions in response to British rule and the inadequacies or the distortions of British rule was a very important part of the story.
I'd also like now to bring the discussion round to the role of elites in working with the British in this period. The title of the book in the UK, the subtitle is What the British Did to India. Could we have called the book What the British and the Indian Elites Did to India? Shashi?
Well, I mean, they were obviously complicit. There's no question. Yesterday in the discussion on the East India Company, we talked about how much betrayal there was and how so many Indians sold out their fellow Indians in the interests of selfish personal gain, whether it was position, whether it was power, whether it was money. And that sadly has remained the truth. And also in every colonial establishment, you need the comprador, you need the collaborator, you need the partner. The British, I've given the figures for the number of Brits in this country, that is army, civilians and business people, at 3 different dates in the late 19th century. And they were always an astonishingly tiny number of people. And the question that many ask is, well, how come the British were able to rule with so few? I mean, you could have, if all of you had collectively blown at them, they would have flown away, But the fact is that, of course, they had this vast enterprise, very well organized, beneath them, of people who were complicit and were helping them. Not only elites, there were some elites. There were some elites, particularly, for example, when the East India Company tried to replicate the squirearchy of the English Midlands in India by creating the permanent settlement. You created a whole class of zamindars and landlords. You also gave people fancy titles, which they started craving. You recognized the various princes and maharajas and went through a fastidious protocol of how many gun salutes, etc., you were going to offer. All of that happened. And all of that happened in ways which obviously involved complicity on the parts of Indians. But you also had the less elite. You had the clerical lot, for example, who learned just about enough English to become the caricatured Babu of 19th century English narratives, or even Kim as this Bengali Babu character. The fact that the British needed those people at the lower echelons of the administration is also something that we participated in. But at the end of the day, the credit I give is to those nationalists who seized upon the opportunity of an English education, for example, to turn it and turn the English language into a vehicle of Indian nationalism, to not just, as Nehru did, write the discovery of India in English, but to use English and English ideas, English values to actually articulate a nationalism that eventually led to our freedom.
John, would you like to come back on the elites question?
Yeah, there's a danger here. We end up in a sort of, argument about relative guilt and, oh, it's the British fault. No, it's the Indian elite's fault. Well, I don't think any of us should be feeling guilty. We should be trying to understand what's happening. And I think, okay, I'm going to say something controversial. The English language was not an imperial project. There was never an imperial desire to impose.
They had no desire to teach it all.
No, they had no desire to teach it at all. Macaulay's Minute, this famous text that says, well, a class of English, Indians who are English in blah, blah, blah. Nobody read it. Nothing happened to it for until really the 1910s and 1920s, kind of when people said, this was what the British were really trying to do. And then at the end of empire, liberal imperialists turned around and said, no, we actually were trying to civilize you all along. Rubbish. It was nonsense. So, I don't,
but even Macaulay's Minute didn't pretend to educate the Indian masses. He said we'll have a small class, buffer class of interpreters between us and the Indian masses.
That's right. But the point about, this point about collaboration and all this kind of stuff, we're forgetting here what the world looked like at this time. Every state was run by a small minority of people. There are many states in which, a relatively small kind of sort of elite govern people, often who are ethnically different from them, across the world. The democracy is something that arrived in the 20th century. So this sense that somehow or other people should feel a sense that, India failed, India didn't resist, etc. India did resist a hell of a lot, but the British had good banks, good credit, and had guns that could blow them to pieces if they resisted sufficiently. That's, there wasn't this great, amazing process of collaboration on the part of Indians. For many Indians, working for the British was the only way they could get a job. If you were a soldier, there were no other armies you could fight for. So, this is not a state that's based on any significant form of collaboration. Most of those who worked for the British, some of them, of course, I'm sure approved of the British, but many didn't. So it's not something we should get hung up on.
Okay, John, in your book you say, and I quote, the British Empire was never a project or a system. It was something far more anxious and chaotic. Could you tell us a little bit more about the anxiousness of the British as a ruling elite and the chaos they engendered as a result of that?
If there's a dominant emotion, if you like, of British power, it's anxiety, sometimes verging on paranoia. My publisher, when they got my manuscript for my book, counted the number of times I'd used the word anxiety and was suggesting I might want to reduce it, which I did a little. But I think it's the dominant concept there. And you read through not the elite text, not the text by the governors who are trying to persuade the public back in Britain how everything's calm and peaceful and fantastic, but you read, as I do in my book, the text, the letters written by district officers, British district officers, local officials, and their writing is suffused by this sense of anxiety. And it comes from the idea that they're always foreigners. They make no effort to ever blend into, to sort of assimilate to India. It's the idea that they believe India is a place that's different from Europe, which in many ways it isn't, I don't think. But they have this idea from the beginning that it's people of a different religion, a society that is, in which there is a lot of violence. They always see India as kind of as somewhere which is violent, where there's continual warfare and so forth. And they have this constant sense that they're trying to assert power. They have a constant sense of not being able to trust the local population and, kind of wanting to defend themselves. And also they're lonely. They're mainly unhappy and lonely. I mean, these are Britons who have gone to India in order to make money, to go back home, not necessarily to make a fortune, but to make enough to live a life of luxury and when they get back home to their sort of families at the age of 45 or whatever, if they haven't died. That's their main motive. So they're lonely and they're unhappy. And I think this powerfully shapes the nature of British rule. It means that you have this rule which is not interested in negotiation, not interested in any joint political institutions. It's constantly on the lookout for imagining that every Indian is trying to challenge them, trying to undermine them, even when there's good trading relations, even when actually they're trading in a mutually beneficial way, and there was some, obviously mutually beneficial trade, the British are always kind of on the lookout for a slight or an insult or something, and then respond as a result to that, kind of violently. And so my argument is that the conquest of India is not this project, this plan, this systematic exercise of power, but it's almost a series of kind of cycles of violence that emerge out of this, profit-hungry, self-interested form of anxiety that the British, are constantly trying to kind of defend themselves, assert their power. Indians respond violently. The British escalate violence, etc., etc. And you get this cycle of violence that really lasts from 1757, from Plassey, it's there before that, to 1857 when, the final conquest of India occurs in this devastating, extraordinary reconquest of India that leads to the British killing at least 100,000 people, and a figure that I don't think is in your book, which is, I'm surprised. So one of the things I'm surprised by about Shashi's book is it's quite bloodless. There could be more violence there. There could be more stories about the
I have
violence.
a page and a half on British massacres, I think, before
No,
I get into
I'm being
Jallianwala
slightly
as illustrative. But no, I don't disagree with much of what John has said, though I will add a couple of things. Racism was a real factor, and I think John has not mentioned it today. It's there to some degree in his book, but I make a lot of it because it's very present throughout. I mean, what he describes as anxiety continued well past 1858, because if you look at, if you look, for example, at the initial admission of Indians into the imperial civil service and how they were treated, they were never given access to the real reins of power right into the 20th century. I mean, it really took the First World War to wipe out a lot of Englishmen in the trenches of Europe before they could finally actually give real power and authority to Indians. But when you look at, for example, I've recounted the episode of one of the early entrants into the ICS, Mr. Chetty. The poor chap he's educated in Oxford and Cambridge and so on, passes his exams in England, is put into this thing and sent to India, but his life is made impossible. For example, he is the equivalent of a district magistrate somewhere. All the decisions are taken in the club, where the police superintendent, the top British officials all meet in the club and they play games and they talk over a drink and they decide. But he is blackballed. He's not allowed to enter the club. So he becomes ineffective because of the mere fact of his color, and he ends up shooting himself, killing himself. It is one story, but it's a true story. And there are other such examples that go through. And when you talk about how they were lonely and unhappy, well, I'm sorry, they were the best paid civil service in the world. The English actually made a higher salary than any civil service, including the American or what they would have made serving Britain in Britain. They got this vast sum of money, which again I've given numbers in the book, for essentially 20 years of service in India, which included 4 years of fully paid furlough back home within that 20. And on top of that, they were able to remit back to England about 80% of their take-home pay. So they didn't do too badly. I wouldn't feel too sorry for the lonely ICS men.
Some of the most wealthy people in the world are very unhappy, but I think they could have made some friends. I mean, it's not impossible for them to have actually, and there is an undercurrent to. There's a critique always of British rule by Britons saying, and by Indians saying, friendship between Indians and Britons is possible, but it's the things that you're describing, the things we're both describing, this attitude towards power, racism that prevents that from happening. Another tragic case is Syed Mahmood, the first...
That's right, the first judge.
Muslim judge in the Allahabad High Court, who's a brilliant lawyer. He's one of the few judges whose judgments courts still go by now, and he was also blackballed from the club. All the decisions were made, kind of somewhere else. And
he took to drink.
He took to drink, and so his father, Syed Ahmad Khan, ended up saying, well, this is what happened when you try and sit at the same table as the conqueror. You cannot do it. And he recognized that this government was one that saw itself as having conquered India, and so it would never accept Indians to be equals in those positions of supreme authority.
So he said basically the lesson you learn is either complete submission to the Brits, or you preserve your self-respect, but then they will not give you any real authority.
Well, there's a third way, which is the way that he took, which is you create institutions somewhere else. You build a university, you build a cultural organization, you set up an educational organization, somewhere that is not going to challenge the British politically, but is, another space, another realm. And that's, Indians are running educational institutions in India almost totally by the 1920s. Calcutta University is an Indian institution, no question, almost a nationalist institution. And yet, the courts, the collectors, the railway department is run by British. In 1940, there was only one Indian chief engineer of the railway. So these are the kind of institutions the British are interested in, But there are plenty of spaces where Indians can build a national life.
Given the depredations of India set out in both your books to astonishing detail and with great clarity, I'd like you to comment now on whether you think that economic and military imbalance post-1857 accounts in part for the largely ethical and moral tone of resistance by Indians, elites and otherwise, to the British. Shashi?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Gandhiji actually said that British rule is a sin. He used very moral language. And mind you, he was actually echoing the kind of language that preachers like William Howlett had used going back to the 1830s. There was a strong British religious critique of empire that was also present alongside, of course, with the official bishoprics and so on that said all the right things the empire wanted to hear. But as far as the moral and ethical element is concerned, yes, definitely. I mean, and some of it was actually crafted in very British terms. Jawaharlal Nehru, for example, as a young man, was sent by the Congress Party to Jallianwala Bagh to do his own inquiry because the British Official Commission had whitewashed Dyer's conduct. And Nehru went there and personally counted the bullet holes and so on. And then when he left Amritsar, by bizarre coincidence, he found himself sharing a compartment with Dyer and Dyer's aides. And Dyer was boasting in the most racist language about what he'd done to the Indians and how he'd gladly do more and so on and so forth. And Nehru, overhearing this, recorded at the time, "To me, this was the height of bad form." Now, you can't imagine a more British critique. The height of bad form was what he said, that what Dyer was saying. So in other words, even within English terms, as it were, there was a moral and ethical critique of the British. And Nehru wrote a wonderful letter to Lord Lothian, which I think I have quoted in the book, in which he basically said, essentially, that what the British have deprived us of, because there's always been this tendency to talk about the various quote-unquote good things, that, especially in the 20th century. And Nehru said, what the British deprived us of is self-respect. And that, I think, is ultimately the key issue which lay behind the critique of British rule.
John?
I don't think he was right. I think to say that Indians had no self-respect until 1947 is ridiculous. I mean, kind of this was, there are many areas of life. This is the point I've been making. Kind of where Indians kind of do things, they run things, they organize things, and kind of so that there's a sort of there's a self-confidence that emerges in lots of ways. Kind of by the 1930s, Indians know that they're going to be running their own country at some point. The British are on their way out, and Nehru knows that. So I suppose the feeling of the desire to assert that sense of self-respect is a very powerful one that feeds importantly, I think, into the growth of nationalism. And I think that the ethical argument is important. I think the Indian nationalisms, Gandhi's kind of non-violence is a response to the cycles of violence that we talked about earlier. That he recognizes the weird, peculiar violence of the British, and his non-violent strategy is all about creating an ethical politics opposed to that. But also, I think there's kind of an ethical capitalism. We view the nationalists as anti-capitalists. They weren't. Lots of them were business people, actually. Nationalism is funded by business people in many ways, and there are many kind of terrible employment practices there. But actually, there's also a vision that you find of a different kind of capitalism that's less rapacious, that's more benign. I'm being, sounding all sort of gooey-eyed Indian nationalist here, but and I think that's something important that then feeds through into the kind of post-imperial period, and it's something I think India, where often there's maybe there's quite a lot of greed around in India now. There's a sort of different kind of capitalism that was discussed by Gandhi, not so much by Nehru, but by many, many other figures in the early 20th century.
And sticking with Mahatma Gandhi for a moment, Shashi, in your book, you write towards the end, the ultimate tribute to the British Raj might lie in the quality of the great soul who opposed it. Why is his manifest legacy now the target of so much criticism in India today?
Well, first of all, the point there was about the fact that Gandhi used tactics and techniques that worked against the British because the British were capable of being shamed by their own behavior. Whereas if you tried that against Hitler, for example, it wouldn't have worked, or against Stalin, or against Mao. So ultimately, there is that acknowledgement that for whatever reasons, including the British desire for their own self-image, as it were, to look in a certain way, they were obliged to allow Gandhiji to continue with his movement on his terms, and the result, therefore, in the end, was a severe discrediting of the British. The entire sort of moral purpose of Gandhiji succeeded in that regard. Today, first of all, Gandhi is still paid lip service to. One of the more astonishing political developments in recent years has been the ruling party, Mr. Narendra Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party, whose intellectual origins are absolutely rooted in hostility to Gandhianism, hailing Mahatma Gandhi as a hero and laying claim to his stature in this country. It's almost more natural when Sakshi Maharaj MP says that you should build statues to Nathuram Godse on January 30th, the day that Gandhiji was assassinated by Godse. That is much more the strain of thought that is reflected in the ideology of the ruling party today. So everyone's willing to pay lip service to Gandhi. The question is to what extent they're willing to accept his practices and principles. In some ways, he's an astonishingly modern figure. I mean, all his most memorable lines would fit into the 140 characters of Twitter. You can think about Mahatma Gandhi using modern social media very effectively. But we've obviously moved beyond the spinning charkha to the silicon chip. We've moved beyond his always somewhat idealized notion of self-contained, self-sufficient village republics into a very different system, a global system as well as a national system of production. And so there are aspects of Gandhiji that seem totally irrelevant. And then when you finally come to his tactics of, satyagraha and fasting and so on, these are being used, frankly, by much less worthy people in much less reputable ways. I mean, you can't go around committing violence and throwing stones and worse, and then threatening to starve yourself. Well, I mean, or even more, the relay fast, which is a modern invention. The whole point about Gandhiji's fasting is that he was inflicting suffering on himself in order to shame the oppressor. Whereas today, when you starve for one day and somebody starves the next day, I'm not sure that you're actually conveying the moral message. So Gandhiji, in many, many ways, has become essentially only a symbol, much less relevant in substance today than perhaps many would have hoped.
I think Gandhi has fallen out of favor in part because India, like many societies, has fallen in love with the big monolithic state, and the idea of sort of centralized political power and the prime minister or the president who can solve everyone's problems, and that's who Modi is, that's who Donald Trump thinks he is, and that's what Gandhi opposed, that idea of everything being all about kind of sort of centralized politics. And his vision was a much more decentralized vision, of local communities, of local institutions. And I think that vision actually has a lot, you find not village republics, that's kind of nonsense. It is the silicon chip, not the charka. But that vision is one that's still important, a society in which people actually do have more scope to achieve their own purposes in kind of smaller units maybe than simply everyone wanting Narendra Modi to solve all their problems. But we've put too much. We seek salvation from these kind of big central political leaders. I hope you don't mind talking to a political leader. And in a sense, there's a kind of politics around local organizing, around what we do together that actually I think we need to return to.
Okay, we've got 5 more minutes from the dais before we throw Q&A open. I'd just like Shashi and John each just talk briefly about post-colonial legacies. One thing in particular, I'm sure the audience is aware that there are 40 lakh people of South Asian origin living in the UK. You may not be so aware that, according to polling, most of them voted for Brexit to keep out further white immigration from Eastern Europe. And many of them are royalists. And I just wondered if you could comment on the enduring British-Indian relationship in light of the pillage and plunder of India by the British for 200 years. Shashi.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I think it's important to stress that what I'm writing about is not about today. Today, we have a relationship with Britain of sovereign equal countries. Our economy is as large as the British economy today. I don't think we need to have a chip on our shoulder about it. And I certainly would not want this book to be seen as in any way having any bearing on the current relationship with Britain. In fact, when my speech keep beating the British at cricket, which I hope we continue to do today in the final ODI. But other legacies of colonialism, of course, even go beyond Britain. I mean, if you look right now, ISIS, Daesh is railing against the British and the French drawing the Sykes-Picot line, which, from their point of view, created many of the territorial complications and messes of the Arab world. You've got severe post-colonial issues in Africa also because of the drawing of lines. When you realize that the last sort of, former colony came to full independence just a decade and a half ago in the 21st century, East Timor, it really is quite startling to realize the extent to which colonialism has lingered on. And even in India, yes, we only have 6 million people who were alive when the British were still ruling us. But once they've talked to their families and their offspring and so on, I'm sure that those who have first-hand knowledge or have heard of first-hand recollections of the Raj are a somewhat larger number. And I think it's important. I find as an Indian, it's very important to forgive, but it's equally important not to forget. I want us to look at the past for its own sake, to face history as history, but at the same time we leave the past where it belongs in the past.
Thank you, Shashi. John, a couple of minutes before we throw it open to Q&A.
Given the fate of our cricket team, I think the comment a friend of mine made on another panel that it might be time for Britain to reclaim cricket might be right, kind of from its appropriation by India. But I think I agree completely with Shashi about what we do now, and that the past and the present are different. 70 years have gone, and the world is a very, very different place now. I suppose my worry about Britain is that we have this kind of, some parts of Britain, not all of Britain at all, has this kind of lingering belief in some kind of imperial sovereignty, which either we have an idea of, we have ideas above our station about the power we had and have within the world, but also we have an idea about what power must mean in Britain. And again, that's my point about political power being too centralized. So I'd like a conversation like this, to thinking about Britain, my own country, to lead to I suppose a rethinking about politics and power, well, in both Britain and in India, in that we can have a kind of British nationalism, a positive view about Britain that is non-imperial, and that would end up being more decentralized and much more democratic. And I think that's true for India too. I think there are lots of legacies of empire in India that people still celebrate. That the supposed steel frame, a very kind of bureaucratic system of government, a law code which Shashi and others have done something to undermine, but which still has many colonial era statutes in it. And actually kind of to have this debate about the legacy of empire and see that many kind of the very centralized and authoritarian structures of power that exist in both our places are a product of this, then allows us to undo that and make our societies much more democratic, which is what we need to do.
Thank you very much, both of you. Q&A follows now, and there is a question that we've already had up to the stage. This is the Patrika Game Changers series. The winning questioner is Rajat Sabawal, and his question to Shashi Tharoor is, what's better, politics or writing books?
Depends on better for whom, because obviously, from the point of view of the person doing one or the other, in writing you have a lot more control over what you write. In politics, I'm afraid, having any control over what you're doing, where you're doing it, how you're doing it, what you're allowed to do, is far, far more difficult. But from the point of view of society as a whole, perhaps politics can make important changes that affect the lives of millions, including generations yet unborn, whereas writing sometimes has that impact. There are some books that last for a long time and profoundly change minds and so on. But a lot, I'm afraid, of what we write is forgotten soon enough and supplanted by other people writing other things. And perhaps, therefore, from the point of view of society, what makes longer-lasting change, if it's conducted right and with conviction and with passion, would be politics.
Thank you. I'm sure you'd like to continue with this discussion for another half hour, or even longer. Unfortunately, we don't have time. I'd just like you to thank Dr. John Wilson and Shashi Tharoor. Shashi will be signing books